Admiral Ernest King would become one of the most influential, if somewhat underappreciated, officers of World War II, leading the US Navy through the vast majority of the US's direct involvement in said World War. Yet his start in life would hardly have suggested such a career for his future. Born on the 23rd of November 1878, the son of British immigrants who lived near Cleveland, Ohio, Ernest Joseph King would not grow up anywhere close to the sea. But his home was part of one of the ports on Lake Erie. His father worked on a steam engine repair shop, the railroad kind, not the naval variant, and the young boy would grow up spending his early years amongst his father's colleagues, picking up an appreciation for machinery, but also a very stubborn and blunt attitude that he'd never really lose. Alternating between school and work in the engine shop, King managed to catch typhoid fever in his teens, and although it was a close-run thing, he managed to pull through and was back working on the engines as soon as he had the strength. He would then move on to the US Naval Academy. Beating out 30 other applicants in a competitive exam process, his period there would span the turn of the century and the Spanish-American War. Here, he decided that, well, a naval officer always had to have enemies, and his natural enemies here were the academic staff, and so he conspired with his classmates to engineer a system that helped the less academic students in order to ensure that they all passed, which meant that for the latter half of his stay at the academy, when the system was in operation, there would be precisely 0 dropouts. He further decided that painting a target on his back wasn't such a good idea. Despite being gifted enough to have a fairly good shot at graduating top of the class, he calculated that this would mean people expected things of him all the time. Better to work his way up the ranks without absurd expectations that even the slightest slip-up could leave people disappointed in, and so he resolved to target a graduation just below the very top, enough to demonstrate his ability, but just low enough to stop people from singling him out all the time. However, the outbreak of the war with Spain meant that it was all hands on deck for the comparatively tiny US Navy at the time, and so King secured himself a position on USS San Francisco, a cruiser which ended up spending a fair amount of time off of New England just in case a Spanish raider appeared. The US Navy didn't think it was likely, but public sentiment was such they felt they had to have something there. And this meant that the sole action he would see during the war was a brief spell on blockade duty, with some shots being sent his way from the Havana forts. During this period, he began to demonstrate a command style for which he would later become famous, or infamous, depending on who you asked. If he didn't know something, and he realised that he didn't know something, he would accept any advice and instruction from somebody that he recognised as an expert in the field. But, once he had assimilated this knowledge to his own satisfaction, he determined himself a similar expert in the field, and would thus brook no further argument or discussion on how a thing was to be done or not done. And if you happened to publicly disagree with him, no matter your rank or status, King would very rapidly do a very, very good impression of a naval boiler with its safety valve disabled. With the war over, King and his classmates returned to the academy, with King graduating 4th in his class. Basically the target that he'd wanted to. And he entered active service in a navy that was very different from the one that he'd joined. Annapolis in 1897 had been a collection of decaying buildings and temporary constructions that happened to date back to the Civil War. Now, between the publication and popularization of Mahan's writings, the Spanish-American War itself, and Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, the naval budget was going up, new ships were coming down the slipways, and Annapolis was even rumoured to have some form of reconstruction planned. The only problem was promotion, which was glacial to a point that it would have embarrassed the 1700s Royal Navy at the height of patronage in peacetime, with most officers not reaching commander or captain rank before they were well into sight of retirement, and most admirals only able to serve for a few years before their health gave out or they reached mandatory retirement age. But King was optimistic that new ships would mean new postings and thus more opportunity for advancement. And so after a short course in torpedo design and use, he set out aboard the survey ship USS Eagle as the navigator. This allowed him to develop his skills in navigation and ship handling at an early stage in his career, and of course, King being king, he took this voyage as an opportunity to work out new methods of navigation, to keep himself entertained, as well as modifying and improving the surveying equipment they'd been issued. This turned out to be followed by a trip ashore to let his eyes heal, as it turned out that staring through precision optical instruments with focusing lenses in the middle of the Caribbean summer was not exactly good for one's vision. This recovery accomplished, his next posting was to the brand new USS Illinois, now serving as signalling aid to the admiral aboard, whereupon he decided once again that the instruments available to him were inferior, and he invented a new semaphore transmitter to make his job simpler and easier. He also began to hear from shipmates that the guns aboard could fire much further than the rangefinders and basic fire control systems they had would allow, a matter that intrigued him, but for the moment he was unable to do all that much about it since he wasn't assigned to gunnery. But his talents were being recognised by the senior officers, and he was soon reassigned to the USS Cincinnati as a watch officer, a position that would normally be given to officers several years his senior. The cruiser then set out for a prolonged overseas assignment, whereupon King heard the US Navy was introducing formal gunnery competitions between ships. Naturally, King decided that his newly assigned gunnery teams must win, and promptly set about dismantling, analysing and improving the rangefinders, sights, gears, and basically everything about the gun except for the barrel itself, and one suspects that was purely because he lacked an oxyacetylene cutting torch. It should come therefore as no surprise that Cincinnati walked away from the Asiatic Squadron shoot with the top prize, much to King's satisfaction. The voyage wasn't entirely without negative issues for King, though. He was confined to quarters several times for returning from shore leave late and drunk, but in typical King manner he decided that this was a weakness to be destroyed and would ruthlessly eliminate that character flaw to such a degree that he would never be late or hungover for duty again, although that didn't stop him drinking. He would, however, end up under confinement several more times for a completely different reason: his temper, which led him, still at the midshipman-ensign rating, to have standing arguments and shouting matches with officers well above him in rank, up to and including the ship's executive officer. While stationed in the Far East, King would get something of a front row to elements of the Russo-Japanese War, but by 1905 he was heading back to the US for new orders, as well as to marry the woman he'd been courting since the academy, Martha Rankin Egerton. This accomplished, he was posted to the USS Alabama, where he was given charge of the forward half of the ship's armament, again a position usually given to someone with significantly more experience. During this voyage, he discovered the journal Proceedings of the U.S. Naval Institute, where officers could express their thoughts openly without too much regard to relative rank. Unsurprisingly, this appealed greatly to King, who took up the cause of organisational reform aboard ships, which had been little advanced from the American Civil War era. Over time, via submissions to the journal, and as his career advanced, latterly via more direct authority, he would undertake a variety of similar personal crusades against everything from bureaucracy to the Bureau of Ordnance to naval uniforms, which he thought should be grey, and the way responsibility was shared down the chain of command. Between his talent and the opening of new positions as the Navy expanded, King advanced from ensign to lieutenant in just 3 years, returning to Annapolis as an instructor, mainly in gunnery and its associated duties, where he lasted for a couple of years. Then he was moved on to being the officer in charge of discipline, albeit that his temper and attitude still managed to get him in trouble with superiors, even there. However, managing to get past that issue found him in 1906, where a war scare with Japan and the advent of HMS Dreadnought had caused an upsurge in interest in fleet actions and the fighting capabilities of both ships and the men who led them, which of course got King interested in that issue as well, and prompted him to work with a fellow officer, William Pye, to develop the US Navy's first range clock, the primary element to a central fire control computer. To his annoyance, and perhaps eternal grievance, the Bureau of Ordnance happily took the design, but refused to pay either officer for their work, or allow them to file for a patent. It wouldn't be the last time that King's anger levels would trip from simmering to apoplectic when it came to that particular organisation. 1909 saw King headed back out to sea as flag secretary to one of his former captains aboard Cincinnati, the now Rear Admiral Osterhaus. With this assignment heading for shore duty in short order, King quickly moved over to another new battleship, the last US Navy pre-dreadnought, USS New Hampshire, this time working in the engineering department. Left alone and in charge of the ship's power plant, a situation that suited him perfectly since it meant relatively rare interaction, and thus conflict, with senior officers, King was in his element. Another competition the US Navy had started was engineering efficiency, and now he was part of this world, King resolved to win here as well, starting another crusade to secure New Hampshire the best coal, the best sailing position, and even to reduce water consumption on the ship. Since the distilling plant needed to burn coal to function, King decided that anyone who used anything but the bare minimum to shower was a personal enemy working against his winning of the engineering efficiency prize, and soon the crew from the captain down to the lowliest recruit was down to using minimal water in their showers, aided by a network of spies that King recruited from amongst the ensigns. He only missed out on the actual prize itself because a couple of other ships managed to lose their screws when running at full power, and the rest of the fleet was temporarily forbidden from full power runs. Transferring back to Osterhaus's staff as flag secretary, as the latter headed back out to sea again, King worked thoroughly and efficiently for the rest of his deployment, landing back ashore in 1912 to serve as the executive officer of the Naval Engineering Experiment Station, as well as working for the US Naval Institute. It was during this time that he first got to see naval aviation, such as it was at the time, in action. But time here would be short, as in 1913 war with Mexico was looming and the 35-year-old lieutenant commander pressed for a command. By 1914 he'd got one, a small 800-ton destroyer named USS Terry. This world of small, fast ships was all new to King, who promptly began absorbing information from the flotilla leader, Frank Evans, who was a superb master of destroyer handling. This would see King moved onto the larger USS Cassin, as well as serving as aide to Captain Sims, who had spearheaded the US Navy's long-range gunnery efforts and was now in charge of the US Navy's Atlantic Fleet destroyers, mainly as a way to test his new theories on destroyer operations in peace. This in turn would lead to King being quickly appointed to command of not only the Cassin, but a 4-ship division within Sims' overall destroyer units. It was at this point that King would have his first run-in with the Royal Navy, and not one he especially appreciated. Various Royal Navy cruisers were prowling just outside American territorial waters, inspecting shipping coming to and from American ports and pouncing on German ships, or ships headed for Germany, the moment that they got the chance. Cassin and her subordinates sometimes had to weave past these ships, who were not going to give way to such diminutive escort vessels. King would later comment sarcastically that the British were very nice to us, to let us use the high seas. Late 1915 saw King reporting for duty as part of Vice Admiral Mayo's staff, whereupon, though technically there primarily for his engineering talent, he began using his recent experience to help Mayo improve the fleet's destroyer scouting plans. He was still on this staff when the US declared war on Germany, and the US Navy promptly dissolved into chaos trying to work out how exactly it was going to go to war when all preparations and even talk thereof had until recently been forbidden on political grounds. This was, however, King's natural environment, and he got to work helping the transition from coal to oil fuel, training up and distributing the many fresh recruits that needed to be fed into the Navy to bring its ships to full wartime strength, and then accompanied Mayo in the wake of Sims in 1917 over to the UK to address some of Sims' complaints, most of which amounted to Sims trying to fight an actual war, and the Navy Department back home seemingly mostly to be focusing on a bizarre and persistent campaign against the growth of trees by generating ever-increasing amounts of paperwork. This would lead to another set of encounters with the Royal Navy, of course. King had the misfortune to arrive at a time when Beatty was in command of the Grand Fleet instead of Jellicoe. War games were being held, and two halves of the Grand Fleet had been separated off, one led by Beatty, and the other by Admiral Sturdy. Fog descended, limiting visibility much as had actually occurred at Jutland. Beatty was hesitant. The fog ended up lifting, only to find that Sturdy, who was far less reserved about his ship's skills in the murk, had completely outmanoeuvred Beatty and had him dead to rights. Instead of trying to save his command, King witnessed Beatty simply cancel the exercise. And needless to say, King was not impressed in the slightest. He found a somewhat better impression when he joined Admiral Jellicoe aboard a destroyer that was guarding a monitor that was undertaking shore bombardment duties in the Channel, which then led to a merry dance of evasion as the German shore batteries tried to take out the destroyer, to no avail. However, this episode of his career, most likely prolonged exposure to Beatty, began to increase his dislike of the British in general, although he would always make exception for officers he thought were competent. The end of the war brought King home as a 40-year-old captain, now in charge of the postgraduate school at Annapolis, where he and 2 colleagues entertained themselves with the simple task of completely reworking the naval officer training program, doing such a good job that it was mostly adopted by the Navy within a few short years, and still forms the basis of the Annapolis course to this very day. King was pretty happy here until he heard Admiral Wilson was inbound to head up the academy. King hated Wilson, somewhat more than he hated most other people, and demanded a seagoing command purely to get away from him, even accepting command of a supply ship just to get away from Wilson. After a year of that, though, King had had enough and asked for another command. Nothing that actually floated was available, but submarine command was, and so he went for that. And in a move that should shock absolutely nobody at this point in the narrative, he promptly set about reorganising everything in his division, forcing his men to live aboard their ships rather than the tenders that they moored alongside, and pressing for a more long-range offensive strategy, as opposed to the coastal defence option. Although, in this case, it turned out his thinking was somewhat ahead of its time. The submarines he had on hand were simply too small, too unreliable, and too cramped to do what he actually asked of them. Moving on to command a submarine base at New London, he ran a tight and, surprise surprise, competitive command. In 1925, the submarine S-51, which was based there, was run down and sunk by a civilian steamer, and King was put in charge of her salvage. At this point, he knew nothing about marine salvage, and the sub rested almost half again deeper than divers were used to working. Despite this, everything was going fairly well, although the divers had to endure dangerous and very adverse conditions, until the day of the raising, when a storm blew up and the sub ended up popping up to the surface on its own, despite only some of the flotation pontoons having actually been attached. Trying to tow it into shallow water failed, and the sub had to be deliberately sunk once more. Eventually, they'd managed to get the sub back up to the surface again and towed into New York, the overall success of the operation netting King a Distinguished Service Medal and public acclaim. King now wanted another seagoing command, but postings were scarce. Cruisers were considered the best option, but the Omahas and Pensacola's were only just entering service, and Congress's chronic underfunding prior to 1916 meant that there were very few other cruiser-class vessels available. There was, however, another opportunity. The Lexingtons were due to finish their conversions and would need captains. But most naval aviators were far too young, despite aviation knowledge being considered necessary for carrier command. The first step on this road was command of the seaplane tender USS Wright. Theoretically, this would then be followed by King learning to fly at a shore station, thus giving him experience of actual flight as well as commanding a ship that dealt with aircraft. Instead, King demanded that his crew teach him how to fly using the ship's seaplanes, which gave him something of an upper hand when he was sent ashore for formal qualifications in 1927, allowing him to reach basic qualification swiftly, even though he was not known as the world's best flyer. He was then recalled to the right and was settling back in when the submarine S-4 was hit and sunk, this time by a Coast Guard ship. Due to his experience with S-51, King was called in. Some of the crew were still alive and might be saved. King promptly took an overnight train through foul weather, then grabbed a lift from the seaplane attached to the battleship USS New York, arriving on the scene the next morning. Unfortunately, the weather was completely awful. The submarine was too badly damaged to salvage via filling the ballast tanks, and the remaining equipment was too primitive, and the remaining crew aboard S4 would sadly run out of air. Nonetheless, King would persist and was able to salvage S4 in roughly the same manner as he'd managed to salvage S51, picking up a new particular target of his hatred, the press, along the way, as a number of papers had accused him and the Navy of negligence, despite King having done everything possible to save the submariners' lives, up to and including forcing the ship to stay out when pretty much everybody else was telling him to go in. Returning to the right with another Distinguished Service Medal for his efforts, he found himself briefly in charge of the US Navy's air component in the Atlantic when the admiral in charge had to go ashore. But soon, in June 1928, King had new orders: command of the USS Lexington. He was elated. Sadly, that wasn't to last, the orders being overruled within a month in favour of assigning him to the Bureau of Aeronautics. He was not happy, and he wasn't exactly shy about letting that be known. Surprisingly, within a couple of years, he was actually in command of the Lexington. Her sheer size had led to the crew becoming somewhat relaxed about discipline. King ended that, churning through officers he felt were inadequate and keeping hold of those who met his exacting standards. The ship was transformed in short order, whilst King set himself the target of learning how to operate a carrier, and once this was done, threw himself into developing new tactics for his ship and its complement of aircraft to utilise. Given that almost no one knew anything about operating such a large carrier and air complement, it was a risky business, and one that skirted with disaster on more than one occasion, with King's temper rising to the occasion, sometimes using the PA system, or on other times just walking to the edge of the bridge and yelling loudly enough to be heard everywhere on the flight deck. For all that, the ship became an expert in its role, even if King used every chance to show off his ship's speed and manoeuvrability, such as that was. At one point, when the fleet was ordered to head home independently, almost everybody else, in keeping with naval tradition, fell in calmly behind the flagship. Except for Lexington, which charged headlong through the formation at full speed while still landing aircraft, reaching harbour so well ahead of the rest of the fleet that it was at anchor with King's absent pennant flying by the time everyone else showed up. King's excuse when he was called to the carpet the next day was, "The signal said to proceed independently, so I did." After 2 years in command of Lexington, which included several war scares and a disaster relief mission, King left the ship to a massive farewell party from his crew, stacks of commendations for the performance of the ship, and arguably placed at the US Navy's disposal the finest operational fleet carrier of 1932. It wasn't so much that King wanted to go, he rather enjoyed his stay on Lexington, but his work had seen him recommended for the rank of Rear Admiral, and now he would attend the Naval War College, where his paper pointed out that America's most likely enemy in the next war would be Japan, and equally certainly, America wasn't really ready for the conflict. He identified a great many reasons for this, including what he saw as an irritating tendency to talk up any American military achievement that might be read in some way as a victory, and promptly black hole anything that was clearly a defeat, which he considered meant that sight was very quickly lost of the reasons why those defeats had occurred, and thus ran the risk of those defeats happening again. At age 54, with his rank as Rear Admiral confirmed, he was looking at about 10 years of flag rank service before he reached compulsory retirement age at 64, and so he set himself a new goal: to become Chief of Naval Operations before that time was up. The demise of Admiral Moffett in the crash of the airship Akron left an opening as the head of the Bureau of Aeronautics, and between some key allies and his own lobbying, King managed to get the job as his replacement. Over the next 3 years, he fought shrinking Depression-era budgets, Congress, and the Bureau of Ordnance to keep naval aviation going. In this, he was successful, and a number of excellent future US Navy carrier admirals, such as Mark Mitcher, would serve under him during this period. In keeping with his career path goals, he set his next target as becoming the rather poorly ordered title of Commander, Aircraft Battle Force, where he would lead the US Navy's entire carrier force. But this time he was thwarted by officers who were none too fond of him and held higher ranks. Instead, he was given command of the other part of the Navy's aircraft division, the Navy's land-based aircraft, and so, having overseen the prototypes of the Catalina flying boat in his previous job, he now got stuck into deploying them into his patrol squadrons. Resenting being confined to land, he summoned his old command, the USS Wright, and set off into the Pacific, roaming around working out which atolls and islands might be usable as future seaplane bases, work which would prove invaluable in a few years' time. He also insisted, in line with his concerns expressed at the War College, on making his pilots fly in all weathers and circumstances, practicing for a war he was increasingly certain would come sooner or later. In 1937, he would get his revenge on those who had spurned him for command of the carriers. An exercise had the carriers due to attack San Diego. King's seaplanes were the defence force. Heavy fog set in that night. The carriers kept their aircraft aboard and locked down. King's Catalinas flew anyway, found the carriers, and come dawn, King's aircraft swarmed the hapless carriers all morning, sinking them and decisively winning the scenario. By January 1938, the now Vice Admiral King was in charge of the carriers, and by 1939, he had Saratoga, Lexington, Ranger, Yorktown, and Enterprise, where once again new ideas began to flow, foremost amongst them reallocation of the carriers from the battle force, where they were tied to the slow standard-type battleships, to the scouting force, where they would be able to operate alongside cruisers and destroyers that could keep up with them at full speed. This was exactly how the US Navy carriers would end up operating in World War II, but more conservative minds than King's shut down the proposal, and in the end it would only be Japan's elimination of much of the Pacific Fleet's operational battleship strength that would see King's ideas brought to the fore by necessity. Nevertheless, King worked on other new ideas. Fleet Problem 19 saw him lead the carriers in a successful air attack against Pearl Harbor, another lesson the US Navy High Command would ignore at their cost. He likewise would run all his carriers together as an operational unit, which would also later become normal practice, running his crews ragged, trying to keep up with him. One rare example of an officer who managed was a certain Captain Arleigh Burke, then in charge of the destroyer USS Mugford. Even Admiral Halsey, who was one of King's favoured subordinates, ended up mostly scrambling around trying to keep up. Come the end of 1939, the post of Chief of Naval Operations was up for grabs. With only 3 years before his retirement, it was now or never for King. But with 74 admirals in the US Navy, and only 3 of them, including King, being so-called carrier admirals, the battleship admirals selected one of their own, Admiral Stark, for Chief of Naval Operations. King was ordered to a position on the General Board. His career, it seemed, had peaked, and he was in what was commonly recognised as a holding pattern awaiting retirement. He arrived at his new post days before the outbreak of World War II in Europe, but he refused to take the new post as a sunset position. When he was ordered to take the Secretary of the Navy on a tour of the fleet, including its deployment to Pearl Harbor, King asked for, and got, an effective blank cheque to upgrade the US Navy's anti-aircraft defences, which he had, by his own work, proved were completely inadequate. With typical ruthlessness, he had the upgrades underway in a matter of months, rather than the typical several years. This time, something he advocated for actually had stuck, and it would go on to save countless lives and ships in the years to come. His continuing energy got him recommended by Secretary of the Navy Edison, and as the situation in Europe deteriorated, King found an ally in his erstwhile competitor, Admiral Stark, who was rapidly coming to realise the US Navy was going to be at war sooner or later, and someone like King would be needed. Bouncing off Edison's recommendations, Stark pressed to have King assigned to take command of the Atlantic Squadron. After a tour of some of his new command alongside the new Secretary of the Navy, Knox, he hoisted his flag aboard USS Texas and set about devising war plans and bringing the fleet up to war-ready status, which was just as well as he discovered Texas's war safe contained precisely one war plan, and that was for war with Mexico. This was all done with remarkable swiftness, albeit King's fanatical desire to manage everything and consider himself the expert in everything that he managed was beginning to show its flaws. As a captain, it had worked brilliantly. As the commander of a relatively small formation, such as the carrier force, it could be made to work for the most part. As the leader of almost every US Navy ship not assigned to the Pacific, it was too much. To his credit, he did eventually recognise this problem and issued a series of orders encouraging independent thinking and action amongst his captains and other senior officers. In January 1941, the position of Commander-in-Chief, US Fleet, was to be abolished and replaced with 3 separate Commander-in-Chief positions: Atlantic, Pacific and Asiatic. This would bump King up to 4 stars, full Admiral, as Commander-in-Chief, Atlantic Fleet. Admirals Hart and Kimmel became the Asiatic and Pacific Fleet Chiefs respectively, with Kimmel slated to become Commander-in-Chief of the US Fleet should war require a combination of 2 or more commands, and thus the older post to be reactivated. King now set about trying to improve amphibious warfare and get his ships overhauled and ready for combat, reasoning that several months of most of his fleet spent in dry dock now was considerably better than finding themselves in a war and having to send his fleet into dry dock piecemeal for refits. The Atlantic Fleet was reinforced, but the plans being put forward would require working closely with the Royal Navy. You might think this was a bad sign, but initially it actually went rather well, likely as the cooperation was entirely under King's control, with US Navy flying boats helping with the search for Bismarck, and plans drawn up for US Navy ships to escort transatlantic convoys, followed by the US Navy escorting troops to relieve the British garrison in Iceland. He also ordered his ships to track any German ship they found and report their location to British vessels, and any attack on American vessels or interests by an Axis ship would result in the destruction of the Axis ship in question without any further warning. Hoisting his flag on the cruiser USS Augusta, King would take President Roosevelt to a secret meeting with Winston Churchill aboard the battleship HMS Prince of Wales. This conference opened up King's complex relationship with the British once again. He got on very well with Admiral Pound, but carried his previous bad impressions from the First World War, and was, if nothing else, an American patriot first and foremost. For now, the two countries' interests aligned. But during much of his interwar writings, King had shown he was under no illusions that in more normal circumstances the interests of the British Empire and the United States of America might clash, and in that case he would of course do everything in his power to ensure a US victory. As tensions between the USA and Germany escalated, King used every chance to weed out the officers he saw as weak and replace them with fresher, more aggressive men. Then came the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet was far less ready for war than the Atlantic Fleet was, although some preparations had been underway at the time. It's almost certain that had King been in charge over there, they would have been considerably more ready. Within a week, the Japanese seemed to be everywhere. Force Z had been sunk, and Germany and Italy had declared war on the USA. King headed back out to lead the Atlantic Fleet into the war he'd spent a year preparing them for, only to be recalled. Kimmel was being relieved of his command. Admiral Nimitz would take his place, but now it was decided the US Navy needed a Commander-in-Chief US Fleet, the position they'd abolished not even a year before, to coordinate this multi-ocean war. King was offered the position. Initially, he hesitated, believing that now his nation was at war, the risk of clashes with Admiral Stark were too great. He had nothing against Stark personally, but the areas of responsibility between Commander-in-Chief US Fleet and Commander-in-Chief of Naval Operations were blurred and overlapping, part of the reason the first position had been eliminated in the first place. But after some negotiation, which included ruling out any obligation to hold conferences with the press or Congress, as well as a degree of control and authority over the various Navy bureaus, which had historically remained very independently minded, he took the job. His only direct report would be to the President, and technically to the Secretary of the Navy. King would deal with the Navy's here and now operations. Stark, as Chief of Naval Operations it was decided, would deal with long-term strategic planning. King rapidly assembled his staff, including one Willis Augustus Ching Lee, and set to work on the business of rebuilding the US Navy into a juggernaut that would crush all of King's enemies before him. He also instituted a policy of rotating his staff between assignment to him and assignment at sea for the most part, the idea being that bringing fresh insights from the front line would be helpful, whilst also sending out men with the broadest picture of the latest developments to help the fighting fleets get into shape was an equally good idea. Fully open joint planning of operations with the British could now begin, but tensions began to surface again. King agreed that a unified command was needed in the Western Pacific to stem the seemingly inexorable Japanese advance. This would evolve into the somewhat doomed ABDA command, but he supported it because it had a specified goal. Churchill's suggestion that the US Atlantic Fleet be subordinated to the Royal Navy for the rest of the war on a similar but more general and open-ended basis met with his immediate rejection. He did, however, approve of a measure that would eventually see the combined chiefs of staff formed to run the war, but a thornier issue was Britain's understandable desire to prioritise the war against Germany versus King's desire, supported by Stark, to focus on the Pacific and Japan. Still, the conference ran its course without anybody getting shot, and King set about giving Nimitz his marching orders to hold the line from Hawaii to Samoa and work with the British to ensure secure lines of transport and communication to Australia were likewise held. He also directed carrier raids on Japanese-held islands, but was soon driven to anger by British and Dutch complaints about Admiral Hart, who was unwell and who many in ABDA command were seeking to blame for the ongoing disintegration of the war effort in that area. Faced with these issues, Hart was recalled, but King felt that Hart and the US Navy had been humiliated, something that he would find very hard to forgive. The predicted, but unwanted, clashes with the Chief of Naval Operations Office saw King given an even greater degree of authority. Admiral Stark was sent to head up US naval efforts in Europe, and so King added the CNO's title to his responsibilities. He was now Chief of Naval Operations and Commander-in-Chief US Fleet, responsible for the global strategy of the entire US Navy, and he managed to get full control over various bureaus at the same time. Now effectively God Emperor of the US Navy, King continued his efforts but was rapidly coming up to retirement age, which would see him out of service by November 1942. However, Roosevelt decided to ignore this requirement and keep King around for as long as was necessary. As ABDA command collapsed, King proposed that the British take charge of everything west of the wedge that was being driven by the Japanese, whilst the US assumed responsibility for everything to the east, which would include Australia. This enabled King to further challenge the Germany First policy, which his position required him to notionally support, but also allowed him to hold the fort against proposals to put MacArthur in charge of the entire Pacific War, which King saw first and foremost as a navy, not an army, matter, eventually managing to pigeonhole MacArthur's command into a relatively confined area where he considered that the general could do relatively little harm to his own grander strategy, especially since most of it was made up of the Philippines, which there was no chance of returning to in anything like the immediate future. In the Atlantic, however, things were not going as well. The American entry into the war meant that the U-boats could now operate off the American coast freely. The British rapidly sent out a volley of suggestions based on their experience so far in the Battle of the Atlantic. This included anti-submarine warfare tactics, a suggestion to have lights out on coastal cities to prevent ships being silhouetted against them, and of course the formation of coastal convoys. Now, King's habit of considering himself to be an expert once he'd learned as much as he considered necessary on the subject came back to bite. He argued that there were not enough escorts for coastal convoys, and unescorted or poorly escorted convoys would only make good targets for submarines. Ordering civilian blackouts was not technically within his remit, but he refused to suggest or support the idea to anybody else, including the President, and indeed politicians up and down the East Coast were strongly against the proposal for commercial and political reasons when others suggested it. But the fact was that both world wars had shown that simply grouping ships together, whilst admittedly running the risk of a target-rich environment for a sub that found such a convoy, reduced the number of overall sinkings because submarines found it harder to locate any targets in the first place. When it came to anti-submarine warfare tactics, King was still opposed to subordinating his ships to others, and that included in methods of operation. Instead, whilst acceding to the idea of a so-called interlocking convoy system, he recommended that the Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy take control of the North Atlantic run, whilst the US Navy looked after the Central Atlantic and the US coast, with each section using tactics of its own devising. Predictably, the US Navy, which was starting from scratch and now found itself technically forbidden from even visiting tactics classes at Western Approaches Command, which, to be fair, was an order that many officers would quietly disregard, would take some time to get its anti-submarine warfare game up to speed as a result. In part, this may well have been because some of the British offer had included sending some of their own escort vessels to work with and instruct the US Navy's escort vessels. Perhaps memories of the Royal Navy cruising up and down the US coast in the 1910s with a casual disregard for the US Navy in its own home waters had left a deeper mark than even King had realised. Paradoxically, King remained a strong supporter of the Arctic convoys and the need for maximum escort to the transatlantic convoys throughout the entire discussion. After losses continued to climb, the government was eventually able to enforce coastal blackouts, and the Navy would start to abandon the hunter-killer tactics that had characterised their efforts so far, and had also represented some of the Royal Navy's 1939-era tactics. And the establishment of the partial convoy system started with merchantmen being escorted by small craft by day, and remaining overnight in protected anchorages. Some of the tension can also be laid on the fact that the measures proposed would require considerable diversion of effort to the Atlantic, which of course the British were quite insistent on, but as we've seen, King would much rather new ships be sent to deal with the Japanese in the Pacific. Speaking of the Pacific, King was pressing his subordinates for aggressive action at every turn, the development of what would become the Doolittle raid mostly originating from his offices. The only downside of this particular operation was that when the Japanese made their move on into the South Pacific, leading to the first big Japanese-US carrier showdown of the war, only Yorktown and Lexington were available to counter them, since Enterprise and Hornet were still on their way back from the coast of Japan. The loss of his old command, Lexington, in this particular battle, caused a shift in King's strategy for a more defensive one. This, and the delicate balance between King and Nimitz, would lead to conservation of American carriers and thus their availability for the Battle of Midway, although this victory also sent King's blood pressure to levels more commonly associated with hydraulic presses, as his nature was to conceal everything, defeats and victories, so that the enemy might not learn anything from him, at least until such time had passed as to make anything they gleaned irrelevant. The cover story for Midway was that the US had guessed the Japanese intentions based on their surmised need to respond to the Doolittle raid and the cancellation of their invasion of Port Moresby. Only King then found two newspapers running headlines claiming that the US knew in advance of the assault, which of course they did, thanks to code-breaking. King was apoplectic, since any foreign agent in the country might now be able to draw the correct conclusions based on reading the newspapers, and thus imperil vast swathes of King's operations. The only reasons that the paper's owners and the reporters weren't actually brought to a trial for treason, which was what King preferred, was that King would have not, of course, released any of the details of how he'd actually come across the information regarding the Japanese fleet to any court, where, of course, it would go on to public record. Although he did arrange for the officer who'd let the reporter see Nimitz's transmissions to that effect to have such a mark placed on his record that he would never be promoted beyond his current rank for the rest of his career. Luckily for all involved, it seemed that Japanese spies did not read the Chicago Tribune. But King could not focus on the Pacific alone, and soon he was having to worry about Operation Torch, the planned landings in North Africa in Vichy French territory, as well as the ongoing Guadalcanal campaign on the other side of the planet. The latter was eating ships at a prodigious rate and desperately needed reinforcements, which would not be forthcoming if they were forced to divert ships to Torch, which at the time was codenamed Gymnast. However, he was overruled by Roosevelt, who insisted that the Army's troops would have a much greater effect on the balance of power if they were fighting the Germans and Italians in some theatre or other, rather than occupying a series of tiny islands in the Pacific that the Japanese had intentionally taken as a kind of transoceanic crumple zone against the possibility of American advances. The one bright spot was that at least a landing in North Africa would be on a smaller scale and less potentially suicidal an operation than the alternative, a landing in Europe in 1942, which General Marshall was advocating for, but which the British had flat out rejected. Whilst King notionally supported Marshall in initial meetings with British leaders, the difference in commitment to a premature D-Day can be seen by the fact that Marshall was hugely unhappy in having to rewrite his plans to instead go after North Africa, whereas King, despite having been told no by the British of all people, was entirely accepting of the change in plans. Perhaps apart from anything else, he realised that this alternative was not going to need quite as many of his ships. Distracted by Guadalcanal again, King appointed Rear Admiral Kent Hewitt to the role of amphibious commander, which turned out to be a masterstroke, as Hewitt got stuck in and organised most of what had been left unprepared at that point. The Guadalcanal campaign itself was becoming something of a headache for King. Just to get it off the ground, he had needed to overcome general army opposition to anything that involved an offensive, whilst also heading off in particular MacArthur's near-insane plan to launch a direct full frontal assault on Rabaul, with himself in the lead. Tempting as it was to King to send MacArthur off in a landing craft to meet the firepower of most of the Japanese surface fleet head-on, King was deeply aware of the cost in lives and ships that this would entail, as well as the narrow chance of success. As opinions seesawed between the two extremes, King had been alarmed to see that each swing attracted more and more people to the Rabaul idea, and so instead he'd come up with a plan that would result in the Guadalcanal landings and sent orders to Nimitz to begin preparations immediately. He was thus able to present the assault at the next Joint Chief of Staff's meeting as something that was 9/10 done already, which was vastly ahead of the still only conceptual arguments that the army was having. He also neatly moved the boundary lines of the operational areas in question so that the Navy would lead the operation and not MacArthur, who desperately wanted to be in command of any offensive, but whom King was equally determined to freeze out of any potential command of naval assets. Of course, for King, the Guadalcanal campaign hadn't started very well, with the First Battle of Savo Island being a disaster, and with his forces stretched thin between North Africa, the Atlantic and the Pacific, King struggled to get enough forces into the area to make good the losses, let alone gain an advantage over the Japanese Navy. The campaign would end up costing the US Navy 2 carriers, 8 cruisers, and 14 other significant warships sunk, and many, many more badly damaged. But in the end, the stream of new and repaired ships coming down the slipways and out of the dry docks, and the tenacity of several American admirals, including of course Ching Lee, who was dispatched from King's command staff to take command of USS Washington a few months previously, saw the campaign through to a victorious end. The Casablanca Conference would then afford more opportunities for further joint US-British strategy, but aspects of this almost began to flounder when King advocated for more British commitment to the Pacific, particularly to keep communication and transport lines to China open, once the Mediterranean had been secured. And the British were of course still mainly concerned about getting forces into Italy, then into France, and taking out Germany, and they wanted to know why more men and ships were needed in the Pacific. Tempers began to rise, and King declared that the Pacific was an American war and he did not need to explain the details, only outline what was needed. Fortunately, both sides were made to cooperate, and the quid pro quo was a British offensive in Burma in exchange for the US lending its strength for the invasion of Sicily. Back at home, King was trying to manage an increasingly impossible balance of shipbuilding. Even the United States did not have unlimited resources of steel, machinery, and money, and the demands for everything from cruisers to landing craft to fleet carriers to destroyer escorts to light carriers were never ending. Prioritising one always ended up getting you stick from 2 others whose programs you delayed. By late 1943, King had also gotten progressively more and more involved in the ongoing Mark 14 torpedo saga. Admiral Lockwood, down in the southwest Pacific, had managed to convey to King some of the further problems his submariners were having, the faults they'd identified, clandestinely and against orders, and the fact that the Bureau of Ordnance was dragging its feet over even admitting there was a problem, let alone issuing permission to fix something that they were still claiming wasn't broken. King overruled the Bureau of Ordnance and instructed Lockwood to tell his men to make any modifications that they could immediately. A year earlier, Lockwood had pled to King, "If the Bureau of Ordnance can't provide us with torpedoes that will hit and explode, then for God's sake get the Bureau of Ships to design a boat hook with which we can rip the plates off a target's side." Following that particular meeting, King had flat out ordered the Bureau of Ordnance to conduct a series of tests to address a deep-running torpedo problem. Against their will, they'd been forced to concede that there was in fact a problem with that part of the torpedo's mechanism. He had several meetings over 1942 and now into 1943 with the Bureau of Ordnance that strangely seemed to have gone largely unminuted. But after each one, the Bureau of Ordnance magically lurched into motion and accomplished something useful. By late 43, they'd even managed to get around to fixing the Mark VI exploder, which was something of a unique achievement for the Bureau of Ordnance at the time. 1943 also saw further clashes between King and the British in the shape of General Brooke. The British wanted to start the build-up of material that would be needed for an invasion of Europe. King did not want to have valuable landing craft lying around English shores, while he could think of better uses for them in the Pacific if there was no firm date established for a landing in France. 1944 would see two major issues, Operation Overlord and the establishment of a 5-star rank, on which King was consulted. The last couple of years seemed to have hardened his degree of Anglophobia. His desire to change the naval uniform to grey and eliminate dress swords from the equipment was, in his own words, significantly because these colours and equipment were inspired by the Royal Navy, whereas King wanted the US Navy to be unique. Likewise, when the title of 5-star rank came up, most were in favour of Admiral of the Fleet. Once again, King's main grounds for opposition were that this was the same title as the one the Royal Navy used, but no one particularly liked his first suggestion of Arc Admiral. Eventually he changed this to Fleet Admiral, and that would be accepted for when the rank was created, and King duly promoted to this lofty height. Working on Overlord had been an exercise in frustration on both sides. Even by mid-1943, King was becoming increasingly angry with the British. In his view, the US was now supplying the majority of the fighting power, and so should be in charge of most, if not all, of the fighting. The British, of course, pointed to their greater experience and the already existing balance of agreements as far as the chain of command went. King's desire to constantly innovate, combined with his increasing issues with the British in general, combined to bring out his temper to even greater heights, to the point that some British officers felt that they could get along with every American officer in the room, with the exception of King. King's idea of compromise was to allow more than his opening position of ships to be allocated to Europe, but in return became increasingly more and more dismissive about anything but American involvement in the Pacific, to a point that by now he was not interested in advice, intelligence, or suggestions from his allies. He declared that he would inform them of what he was going to do next, and that would be all. The ice was metaphorically and literally broken in one such conference when Lord Mountbatten changed the subject entirely to the concept of the Pykrete Leviathan HMS Habakkuk, although the tension-relieving effect internally was almost undone as the ricochet from Mountbatten and loading his pistol into a block of pykrete popped a neat hole in King's trouser leg. Luckily, King liked Mountbatten, although what he perceived as a lack of support from the British High Command for Mountbatten's efforts in the Pacific theatre undid any lessening of King's growing antipathy towards the rest of the British staff. Some mark of the tensions between the groups can be gleaned from the fact that the gunfire had prompted some of the staff outside the room to seriously consider, first, whether the two sides had developed into shooting at each other, aside from any other possible explanation. Still, preparations for Overlord continued apace, and oddly enough, with Admiral Pound succumbing to a brain tumour, Admiral Cunningham, his replacement, in the end found common ground with King. Not that the two got on all the time, in fact precisely the opposite, but King had always respected a man who stood his ground and fought it, and Cunningham, who would much rather be at sea throwing shells and aircraft at the enemy, refused to give so much as an inch to King and would fight him hard on almost every point of disagreement, as well as every time King made a disparaging comment about Britain in general and the Royal Navy in particular. And both sides ended up respecting the other's tenacity, and whilst the house was sometimes well and truly on fire, they still did strike up an unlikely friendship and get on with the business of naval operations pretty well. Whilst this was going on, the war in the Pacific was accelerating as Japanese resistance began to collapse at sea thanks to relentless pressure from King and Nimitz's growing fleets and the fall of the outer garrisons. Whilst there were arguments between Nimitz and King as to whether to take Truk first or bypass it to hit the Marianas, by now this was less an argument over how to put Japan on the back foot, but whether to land a left or a right hook first. As it turned out, the Battle of the Philippine Sea was more of a heavy uppercut to the face of the Japanese Navy's combat power, even if Truk in the end was bypassed. Things were going so well in his view by 1944 that despite his antipathy towards the press in general and the fact that he didn't consider himself a particularly good man to be on camera, King agreed to take part in a small propaganda film for the US Navy. So let's hear something of King's own words. In this extract in which an narrator sets the initial scene.
Navy Day 1943, 1 year ago. The Navy had come a long way since the dark day at Pearl Harbor. Within 2 years, we had rebuilt our shattered fleet. Americans saluted a bigger, more powerful Navy than any the world had ever known. On every ocean, the fleet was in action. In the Pacific, after 2 years of a desperate holding war, we were ready to take the offensive. Behind, on Navy Day 1943, lay Guadalcanal. Behind lay victories in the Coral Sea, Midway, and the Aleutians. But ahead, for every man on every ship, lay hard and bitter fighting to execute the master plan agreed upon by the High Command and Admiral King.
In the Pacific, we face two major enemies, distance and the Japanese. Both will become tougher as we advance. We are fully aware of these problems, and we have made plans to solve them. In spite of great distances and a fanatical enemy, we will go forward. We will not stop this side of complete victory.
As things turned out, King was rushed off his feet by keeping track of the Marianas assault and D-Day at the same time. But one operation was considerably larger than the other, and so 2.5 decades after King had stood beside Jellicoe off the Belgian coast, he now found himself once more aboard a destroyer, this time American, touring the Channel on June 10th, 1944, watching the combined Allied fleet sending hundreds of tons of high explosive inland with every passing minute. But for King, this wasn't close enough, and he and his colleagues were soon walking up Omaha Beach courtesy of a DUKW trip ashore. Follow-up landings in southern France, Greece, and the continued Italian campaign continued to generate friction, and it was only by some clever work by his subordinates that King was rescued from a number of political minefields. King was many things, but politically aware was not one of them. Luckily, once so informed, he was generally adept, after some persuasion, of digging himself out of the problem by expedients that were often, in practical terms, little more than the basic smokescreens upon which much of politics relies. As the war in Europe began to accelerate toward a land campaign more than anything involving substantial naval requirements, all eyes began to shift back to the Pacific, amongst the various admirals of all the Allied navies. But by this point, King didn't want the Royal Navy involved at all, although in this he found himself somewhat isolated. Churchill was itching to get the Royal Navy into the Pacific in strength and sold the idea to Roosevelt, over King's head. The other American flag officers present could also see the use of dozens of additional warships and several hundred more carrier aircraft. King was forced to give in, with his only proviso remaining being that the British Pacific Fleet would have to be entirely self-sufficient. Meanwhile, he also had to try and deal with trying to rein in an increasingly erratic Halsey, the full extent of the near disaster at Leyte Gulf having caused quite some concern once it was fully known and understood in King's command staff. He had to try and do this without compromising the public image of the Navy that Halsey's aggressiveness had helped to engender earlier in the war. Still, whilst the fighting on land remained fierce, the US Navy King had shaped was almost entirely dominant on the seas, with Halsey running his fleet into 2 more typhoons, which ended up causing more casualties in terms of aircraft loss and men killed than contemporary Japanese attacks over the same period. King was forced into biting down on his initial urge to relieve Halsey, especially after the second incident, in order to try and bring the war to an end on a high note instead of the unseemly squabble in the highest echelons of flag rank that would have ensued had he tried to pull Halsey off the front line. Still, the war wound itself up with the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and King had one last battle to fight, with MacArthur again, who this time was aiming to have himself the sole signatory to the Japanese surrender. King and his staff managed to downgrade this to MacArthur signing as commander of the Allied forces in the area, with King getting Nimitz in on the list as US representative, and thus all the Allied nations involved would have to sign as well. Amusingly enough, it turned out that King would rather let the British share in his triumph before allowing MacArthur to steal the glory in any major way. With the war over, King began rapid preparations for a well-earned retirement. He recommended the position of Commander-in-Chief US Fleet be abolished again, which it duly was, leaving the position of Chief of Naval Operations as the unchallenged head of the US Navy. Secretary of the Navy Knox had died in 1944, replaced with Secretary of the Navy Forrestal, with whom King had clashed often and intensely. And so King used his resignation letter to President Truman to recommend Nimitz for the Chief of Naval Operations position over Forrestal's choice. He got his way and stood down from active duty on December 15, 1945, bringing to an end a career that had started when the US Navy was groping its way towards being able to confront Spain on America's own doorstep, and concluded with the US Navy being the largest fleet on the planet by some considerable margin. Plaudits and honours from all sides came his way, and King would retire to a life nearby in Washington, D.C., from which he would remain active until 1947, when a stroke, followed by ill health, compelled him to relocate to a series of naval hospitals. The Navy Department became anxious to make plans for King's eventual funeral. George Russell later recalled, "Beginning with General Pershing's funeral, the most elaborate of funeral arrangements were made for senior people in the armed forces, including all 5-star officers. In order to make the necessary arrangements, somebody had to find out from the officer himself what his wishes might be, or what arrangements he had already made, and I was nominated to go and see Admiral King on this subject. He was then in his office on Constitution Avenue, and after I had made known to him the purpose of my call, he sat back in his chair and roared with laughter. When he had finished laughing, he said to me, 'Well, Russell, I hope this isn't urgent.' It wasn't too urgent. King would write a foreword to a history on the US Navy's operations in World War II, his own autobiography, and a number of other papers, before eventually passing away on the 25th of June 1956, at the age of 78. He would be buried in the US Navy Cemetery at Annapolis, more than half a century after he'd first crossed its threshold. The vast granite complex a far cry from the mess of rickety huts and propped-up fire hazards of his youth, the progress representing something of a fitting metaphor for the legacy and navy that he left behind.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.